Welcome back, truth seekers, to Deadly Truths, Season 2, Leavenworth, Halloween in the Big House. And I'm your host, Becca. So today we're going to dive into In Cold Blood, one of the most chilling true crime stories ever told. And we will tie it back to Leavenworth, Kansas, justice, and even the specter of prisons. Before we begin, a heads up, we're going to talk about murder. We'll name names. We'll do our best to handle the victims with care and respect. And let's remember why we tell these stories so we never forget their humanity. Let's start with the beginning, how In Cold Blood began. So picture this, November 15th, 1959, a quiet rural corner of Kansas called Holcomb in Finney County. A family like any other, Herb Clutter, his wife Bonnie, and their children, Nancy, who was 16, and Keenan, who was 15. It is important to note that they did have two other children, Ivana and Beverly, but they were living elsewhere at the time. Thank goodness. Herb Clutter was a respected farmer, considered honest and reliable, reasonably prosperous in his community. Bonnie suffered from health issues, including episodes of depression, sometimes portrayed in the book that Truman Capote wrote as more severe, and this was later disputed. But she was known as a caring mother, and that's the important part. To set the stage, Truman Capote, the New York writer, learned of these murders early on before the killers were actually caught. He decided to make a trip to Kansas, accompanied by his old friend Harper Lee, to investigate, interview, and rebuild what happened into a nonfiction novel. Now, the twist. The men who committed this crime, Richard Dick Hickock and Perry Edward Smith, were at least in part motivated by a rumor. While in prison, Hickock's former cellmate, his name was Floyd Wells, told him of the Clutter family and that they had a safe in their home. Floyd had worked on their farm as a hired hand, so he was just making this up just to fill the space as they're stuck in prison. So he's just telling stories. So he tells Hickock that they have a safe in their home, and he tells them that it's filled with $10,000. Back then, that was like an insane amount of money. This information lights the fuse. But spoiler alert, there's no safe. Herb Clutter did most of his business by check, and the safe did not exist. In a way, the story is also about illusion. The criminals chasing a phantom, trusting inside the prison hearsay over reality. So here's what went down. On the night of November 14th, in 59, Hickock and Smith drove more than 400 miles to Holcomb, Kansas. They arrived sometime after midnight. The Clutter house had an unlocked door, or at least a door that allowed them entry. The two men slipped in while the household slept. They awoke Herb Clutter after realizing there was no safe. They bound and gagged the entire family and then debated what to do. At least by Truman Capote's account, once they decided there could be no witnesses, violence became inevitable. The sequence of murders is especially brutal, so trigger warning here. First, Herb Clutter, his throat was slit, and then he was shot in the head. The children, Nancy and Keenan, they were both shot in the head with a shotgun. And finally, Bonnie Clutter, she was also shot. There's conflicting statements that exist as to who shot whom. Hickock always insisted that Smith did it. Smith at first claimed Hickock shot the woman, but later accepted responsibility. By the time morning dawned, four members of this family were dead. The killers made off with less than $50 in cash, a portable radio, and a pair of binoculars. Hardly the haul they had hoped for. No safe, no big bags of cash, just horror. And they had just murdered nearly an entire family. Absolutely despicable. The crime scene was so grisly. Neighbors would later shudder recalling these details. And Truman Capote's telling interweaves not just the facts, but the emotional weight of this happening in a rural community in the middle of Kansas. The Clutter murder sparked mass public outrage and a lot of media attention. But how did the killers get caught? Remember Floyd Wells, the former cellmate who had tipped Hickock off about the safe that did not exist? Well, guilt in the lore of the reward drove him to come forward. He arranged a meeting with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and shared what he knew. Using this lead, investigators zeroed in on Hickock and Smith. The two were arrested on December 30th, 1959, in Las Vegas for unrelated charges: parole violation, bad checks, driving a stolen car. They're kind of just basically on a crime spree at this point. Once in custody and confronted with the evidence like bloody footprints, eyewitness accounts, both men confessed. Though each tried to shift the responsibility, can't say I'm very surprised by that. Hickock claims Smith did the killing. Smith initially blamed Hickock for the women, then accepted full responsibility, as I had mentioned before. And the trial took place in Garden City, Kansas, from March 22nd to March 29th of 1960. Both pleaded insanity. And yeah, I guess on some level, they were crazy, right? But that doesn't mean that they didn't know right from wrong in the legal context. That means you're guilty and you can't plead insanity. So local doctors did declare them sane, and the jury deliberated for only 45 minutes before finding them both guilty on all accounts. Sentences: death by hanging, mandatory at the time under Kansas law. Over the next 5 years, there were appeals. Some made it as high as the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to intervene. The media coverage, psychological arguments, all were part of the public conversation being had. But finally, on April 14th, 1965, both men were executed by hanging at Kansas State Penitentiary. It's actually in Lansing, but it's part of the whole Fort Leavenworth prison system. Hickock was hung first, and he was pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m., and then Smith was hung second and pronounced dead at 1:19 a.m. When I'm doing this type of research, I'm thinking about, what was this person thinking at this time? What could their emotions have been like? Think about being Smith, the one to go after Hickock. Think about what that would feel like, standing there just waiting. He went first, you're going second. I mean, it's not like you're about to jump out of an airplane or something like that. You're being hanged. You're gonna die. Again, I'm not saying these guys didn't deserve it. They murdered an entire family. I'm just saying this part definitely made me think twice. So before his death, Hickock shook hands with KBI agents and said, "No hard feelings." I find that interesting, but also it's kind of nice of him, right? And he declined to make any big last statement. Smith, meanwhile, attempted to critique the capital punishment and saying it was legally and morally wrong. And as you know, still to this day, there is a lot of arguments around if the death penalty is morally wrong or right. It raises a big question. Should we respond to killings with killings? And the person who has to be the executor, how do they carry that weight, right? Makes you think. So let's pause and look more deeply at Hitchcock and Smith, because behind the killers are broken lives. You got Richard Dick Hickock, born June 6th, 1931 in Kansas City, Kansas, and he was athletic in high school. He had dreams of college, but he lacked the means. He didn't have the money to go. And back then, if you didn't have the money, you weren't going to college. He had been in a serious car wreck in 1950, and this left his face asymmetrical. So when they stitched him up and everything, it really altered his appearance. And when your face is mangled, it's going to also alter your trajectory. He drifted. He worked odd jobs. He was a mechanic, a railroad worker, but engaged in counterfeiting, bad checks, and burglaries. So at the end of the day, he made some really bad choices. While incarcerated, that's when he met Smith and Wells. And after release, he was the main one to scheme the Clutter robberies. Well, I think everything kind of hinges on some extremely bad decisions made by Hickock. Then you got Perry Edward Smith. He was born on October 27th, 1928 in Huntington, Nevada. He had a troubled childhood. There was abuse. He was orphaned, tons of instability. His mother died when he was young. He and his siblings suffered through tons of different institutions. He had chronic leg pain, injuries from earlier accidents, and he used aspirin heavily. Like he was just eating aspirin all the time. They say this probably impacted his health. He was less polished than Hickock. He had fewer social skills because he had grown up in the system. Where Hickock, even though his face had been mangled in that accident, all in all, he had a pretty decent upbringing. So when you look at Perry, you've got to consider that there was more emotional volatility. But he also had interests. He liked art and literature and music, especially during his years on death row. He did have a bit of a relationship with Truman Capote and with fellow inmates, but they were complex relationships. He alternated between defiance, remorse, and even some introspection. So he obviously just had a lot going on in his head. But again, he just murdered a whole family. I would like to think he did have a lot going on in his head, right? And plenty of time to think about it before he met the hangman's noose. In Truman Capote's narrative, these two, they were so different. They're drawn together by desperation and shared scars. Hitchcock, the planner, cold and pragmatic. Smith, the unstable, haunted man, full of dreams and ghosts. The friction between them, it does help define the tragedy. You might ask, what does this have to do with Leavenworth or with prisons or even with Halloween? Well, it has quite a bit to do with all of the above. Leavenworth, Kansas, and nearby Lansing State Penitentiary are institutions that loom large in American criminal lore. The U.S. Penitentiary at Leavenworth, it's a federal prison, has housed many infamous inmates over the decade. And Deadly Truth Season 2 is centered here because the stories of incarceration, redemption, cruelty, justice often intersect in Kansas. You can hear all the earlier episodes digging into Leavenworth's haunted cells, the famous inmates, and the deaths behind bars. But here, with In Cold Blood, the Clutter killers were not held at Leavenworth, but their end game, the execution, the prison appeals, the inmate life, the guilt, lives in the broader American prison system. The big house metaphor is apt. The walls, the cells, the echoes. So, Halloween, the time of year when shadows matter, when we confront fear, when we imagine spirits lingering, telling In Cold Blood inside a prison themed season around Halloween gives it a resonance. Criminals, punishment, darkness, confinement. The moral corridors of the law feel haunted this time of year. And also, one might draw parallels between the darkness inside human hearts and the darkness inside prison walls. The question, where does justice end? Vengeance and cruelty begin. That boundary haunts us. One more note. After their deaths, Hickock and Smith were buried in Mount Muncie Cemetery in Lansing, Kansas, near Kansas State Penitentiary. In 2012, their bodies were exhumed in hopes of solving a cold case, the Walker family murders in Florida. They were going to use their DNA, but no definitive link was found. Interesting, right? Thus, the ghosts of the crime have never fully gone away. So, how did In Cold Blood truly end? After execution, investigators, writers, and the public debated for decades. Capote's work became a landmark in true crime and journalism. They kind of say he is the father of true crime. He basically birthed the genre, so to speak. But some criticize Capote. Did he fabricate the dialogues? Did he over dramatize for narrative flow? Some locals and critics say parts were definitely fictionalized. Still, In Cold Blood influenced how we tell true crime, the mixture of character study, fact, and psychological depth. In Kansas, the Clutter murders left scars, doors were locked, trust eroded, the sense of rural safety shattered, along with all the other stories that I tell in this podcast, right? Each one eroding how we trust one another, our neighbors, or the stranger just walking down the street. The debate over the death penalty continues, especially when the humanity and tragedy behind each life does emerge. The legal, moral, psychological questions remain unsettled. I don't think they will ever be settled. For Leavenworth's story arc, this episode shows that even outside its brick walls, the legacies of crime, prison, morality, and healing echo across the state. The big house is more than a building, it's a concept. And in Cold Blood lives that space. Next episode, we return to the walls of Leavenworth itself, ghosts, prisoners, and a Halloween tale that didn't make the textbooks. But before we go, if you like this episode, rate it, subscribe, and if you're in the mood, go dig up Capote's In Cold Blood or one of the documentaries on Netflix, A&E. You'll find plenty of documentaries on In Cold Blood. There was even a movie made. And see how the story shifts by medium. History is rarely static. Until then, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never forget that darkness once lit guides the way.